A silent earthquake. Every once in a long while, the Supreme Court drops a decision that doesn't explode across cable news or dominate social media feeds, but quietly changes the legal landscape underneath our feet. These rulings don't rely on outrage, politics, or headlines. They rely on the force of reasoning, and they are often the most disruptive of all. This is exactly what happened in Barnes versus Felix, a case that arrived without fanfare but instantly rearranged how government power can be used against citizens in real-world encounters. Not in theory, not in debate halls, but in the kinds of moments that define freedom. A traffic stop, a knock on the door, a misunderstanding over lawful carry, a mistaken identity, a perceived threat where none existed. In a rare moment of total agreement, the court voted 9-0, and instead of protecting the status quo, they dismantled a long-standing doctrine that courts had been using for years to excuse excessive force. Then they replaced it with something entirely new, a framework rooted in context, accountability, and constitutional balance. If you own a firearm, carry one, keep one for self-defense, or simply care about how far the government's authority can go before crossing constitutional lines, you need to understand this ruling, because it doesn't just touch the Second Amendment debate, it changes its terrain. Section 1. The story. Barnes versus Felix began with a situation that nearly every firearm owner, concealed carrier, and responsible citizen can understand. A routine encounter that changes direction without warning. Officer Robert Felix pulled over Ashton Barnes for suspected violations. What followed was not a shootout, a chase, or a violent exchange, but a rapid chain of instinct, fear, and split-second decisions. Barnes partially complied. He opened the door, appeared to follow the officer's commands, and then abruptly attempted to flee in the vehicle. Felix reacted by stepping onto the vehicle's door ledge, a decision that would define the rest of the encounter. Within approximately 2 seconds, the vehicle moved. Felix fired 2 shots into the cabin, and Barnes was fatally struck. From the first motion to the final shot, 5 seconds passed. But the family didn't frame the case around those 5 seconds. Barnes's mother filed suit, arguing that the constitutional question was bigger. Did the government use force in a way that violated the Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable seizures? And more importantly, what standards should courts use to judge what happened? That question transformed the case from a tragedy into a test of the legal rules that decide how far state power can reach when interacting with private citizens in real life. Section 2. The moment of threat. Lower courts evaluated Barnes versus Felix using a doctrine known as the moment of threat rule, a framework that shaped excessive force rulings for decades. Under that rule, courts are instructed to zoom in on a single point in time, the instant an officer uses force, and determine whether a reasonable officer would have perceived a threat at that exact moment. Everything else was treated as irrelevant. Escalation didn't matter. Miscommunication didn't matter. Alternative options didn't matter. Even officer-created danger often didn't matter. In practice, this meant that if Felix feared harm in the final 2 seconds on the vehicle door, the shooting was justified. And that's exactly how both the District Court and the Fifth Circuit ruled. They ignored the earlier conduct, the decision to step onto the moving vehicle, and any opportunity to de-escalate. But here's the constitutional problem. When judges isolate force to a single moment, they shrink the Fourth Amendment into a snapshot. The amendment was never meant to operate that way. It's supposed to measure reasonableness, not in isolation, but within the flow of human events. Because real-life encounters don't come in frozen frames. They come as sequences, conversations, warnings, and misunderstandings that build into outcomes. The Supreme Court saw that disconnect, and it became the hinge point of the entire ruling. Section 3. The rejection. In a unanimous opinion written by Justice Elena Kagan, the Supreme Court rejected the moment of threat doctrine outright. Instead, the court held that excessive force must be evaluated using the totality of circumstances, a standard that requires courts to look at the entire timeline of events, not just a freeze-frame moment. The court emphasized that reasonableness under the Fourth Amendment cannot be judged in fragments. Officers' earlier decisions, verbal cues, escalation, alternatives, and opportunities to de-escalate all become relevant evidence. For the first time in years, the court reinforced that constitutional accountability applies to the entire encounter, not merely to the final shot. That is a profound shift. It restores the Fourth Amendment's depth after decades of being narrowed by lower courts. Section 4. Why gun owners should care. Gun ownership increases the likelihood of law enforcement encounters, not because of crime, but because lawful carry intersects with policing. A routine stop can involve disclosing a firearm. A red flag visit may involve verifying legality. A mistaken identity search may involve self-defense weapons, and misunderstandings can escalate in seconds. Under the old rule, courts often ignored everything leading up to the moment force was used. That meant lawful carry could be misinterpreted as aggression, and there was no constitutional space to consider context. The new rule changes that. Courts can now examine whether a lawful gun owner was complying, de-escalating, or simply misunderstood. Officers can no longer use perceived fear in a split second to override the reality of what happened before. That makes this ruling a major win for concealed carriers, open carriers, self-defense advocates, and anyone familiar with how fragile those interactions can be in real life. Section 5. The new legal framework. By shifting to the totality of circumstances, the Supreme Court didn't just refine a test, it created a new framework for how rights operate in modern policing environments. The Second Amendment protects the right to keep and bear arms. The Fourth protects against unreasonable seizure and excessive force. Barnes forces courts to treat these rights as intertwined, not isolated. Under the new framework, lawful possession cannot automatically justify force. Escalation becomes reviewable. Misunderstandings become constitutionally relevant. The officer's conduct is evaluated alongside the citizens. Context matters as much as perception. That framework pushes excessive force law out of instinct and into analysis. It forces judges to acknowledge that rights must function in the real world, not simply on paper. And it reinforces that constitutional protections do not disappear the moment blue lights come on. Section 6. Repercussions for courts. The Supreme Court didn't just correct a single bad ruling. It disrupted the legal architecture around excessive force across the federal judiciary. For decades, different circuits applied different levels of scrutiny. Some leaned heavily into moment of threat. Others experimented with broader context but without a consistent framework. Barnes versus Felix gave them one. Here's what this means in real terms. Pending cases involving the police force may now have to be reevaluated because the standard they were judged under is no longer valid. Appeals lawyers who previously hit dead ends suddenly have fresh constitutional oxygen and an opportunity to revive claims that seemed unwinnable before. Lower court judges are now required to weigh timelines, escalation decisions, training, warnings, commands, and verbal cues, not just the final freeze-frame moment. State attorneys and municipal defense teams will need to adjust their litigation strategy because narrow defenses like reasonable threat in the final second no longer carry the same shielding power. This wasn't merely a rebuke of the Fifth Circuit, it was a recalibration of federal jurisprudence. And because it arrived unanimously, courts cannot write it off as ideological noise. It's authoritative constitutional instruction. Section 7. The gun owner's reality check. For lawful gun owners, this ruling closes a gap that should never have existed. Armed citizens interact with law enforcement in dynamic environments. Traffic stops, license checks, mistaken dispatch calls, red flag orders, home visits, or even misunderstandings at ranges or hunting lands. These encounters are not theoretical. They are routine. Under the old doctrine, a gun owner's legal rights were vulnerable to the officer's subjective fear in the final second. Fear that might stem from misunderstanding a holstered firearm, a declaration of carry status, or lawful compliance that looked threatening under stress. Barnes versus Felix changes the calculus. Officers must be accountable for how an encounter is shaped before force occurs. Courts must acknowledge lawful conduct that shouldn't be misinterpreted as aggression. Self-defense claims and wrongful shooting cases gain a constitutional bridge between the Second and Fourth Amendments. This ruling does not handcuff police. It simply prevents constitutional rights from being reduced to snapshots. And that symmetry, where both the citizen and the state are accountable for their conduct, has been overdue for decades. Section 8, Second plus Fourth Amendments together. For years, the Second Amendment and Fourth Amendment lived in separate legal conversations. One governed the right to own and bear weapons. The other protected against unreasonable searches, seizures, and state force. Barnes stitches them together because here's the quiet truth. A right you are punished for exercising is not a right. It's a conditional privilege. The Supreme Court's new framework acknowledges that successful firearm regulation in a constitutional republic requires more than permissions. It requires fair treatment. If the state misreads the existence of a firearm as justification for harm, seizure, or force without proper context, then the right is gutted in practice even if it lives on paper. Barnes prevents courts from rubber stamping that dynamic, and that creates a new alignment. The Second Amendment protects the capacity to bear arms. The Fourth Amendment protects citizens from being treated as a threat solely for doing so. Together, they form a protective shield that is stronger than either one standing alone. For the first time, the legal system is acknowledging that constitutional rights interact, overlap, and sometimes require reinforcement. Section 9. The road ahead. This decision is already being compared to Miranda, not in subject matter but in consequence. Lawyers, scholars, and civil rights advocates see Barnes as the beginning of a new era of accountability around the police force. And the effects will ripple outward. Police training will need to incorporate context analysis, escalation, and decision sequencing. Cities and states may face more litigation when force is used improperly. Gun rights advocates gain a stronger constitutional narrative for citizen protection in ambiguous encounters. Academia will reframe Second plus Fourth Amendment intersections as a single analytical field rather than two isolated debates. And perhaps most importantly, public perception will shift. Once courts accept context, citizens expect it. When the Supreme Court speaks unanimously, they are not signaling politics, they are signaling permanence. Barnes is the kind of ruling that lawyers will cite for 10 years, courts will build on for 20, and citizens will feel for the rest of their lives. Section 10. Why it matters. The headlines didn't light up. Cable news didn't break away from celebrity drama or political brawls. But Barnes versus Felix quietly changed how power and rights interact at the most volatile point in American civic life, the point where the individual meets the state, because ultimately this decision reaffirms a basic constitutional truth. Rights are not designed for convenience. Rights are designed for conflict. They matter most when the situation is tense, misunderstood, emotional, and fast. Barnes ensures that courts cannot ignore those moments simply because they are messy. If you carry, if you own, if you believe in constitutional boundaries, or if you simply care about the limits of state power, this decision matters. Why this ruling matters. Before you leave this video with a takeaway, ask a simple question. Would this ruling exist if the court believed rights were optional? 9 justices agreed not on policy, not on ideology, but on structure. The Constitution demands context, proportionality, and accountability. And that demand now extends to the moment a trigger is pulled, a door is opened, or a citizen exercises a lawful right. If you take nothing else from Barnes versus Felix, take this. The legal system has finally acknowledged what gun owners have known for years, that rights do not exist in isolation. They exist in real encounters, under real pressure, and they must withstand real scrutiny. More rulings are coming, more frameworks will change, and the convergence between the Second and Fourth Amendments is only beginning. Stay informed, stay capable, stay constitutional, and stay free.